Tendai Love More Huchu. And we are talking about sexualities in your works. So we're going to start with Tendai giving us a bit of a little reading from The Hairdresser of Harare.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zukiswa. It's good to be here. I feel old now because The Hairdresser of Harare came out in 2010. So sometimes reading a work after a while like that, it looks like traveling back in time. And as a writer, you're always like, oh, that line is clunky. You're always re-editing it. So you forgive me if I cringe a couple of times. So The Hairdresser of Harare is the story of Bimbai, who's a hairdresser in Harare, and she's trying to make a life for herself and her daughter. It's set kind of between 2000 and 2008 when we had hyperinflation and all these issues in Zimbabwe. But along the way, she meets a dashing young man who wanders into their salon and gets a job and becomes a rival. This leads into a quasi-romance, but this young man, Dumi, is hiding a secret, but it's an open secret to the reader. And so the story is about how Wimbai copes with that and how their relationship develops. So I'll start from the first chapter in which she describes herself and her work. So imagine me as a Zimbabwean woman. I knew, you guys got it so late. I knew there was something not quite right about Dumi the very first time I ever laid eyes on him. The problem was, I just couldn't tell what it was. Thank God for that. There was a time when I was reputed to be the best hairdresser in Harare, which meant the best in the whole country. Amaindoro was the fussiest customer to ever grace a salon, and she would not let any ordinary kia touch her hair. Having sampled all the salons in Harare and rejected them all, she settled on ours. The fussiest customer was also the largest motormouth and gossip monger. Once she was our client, we never needed to advertise again as long as we kept her happy. That was my job and why Mrs. Kumalo paid me the highest wage. Kumalo Hair and Beauty Treatment Salon was in the avenues, a short walking distance from the city center. We did hair, but never any beauty treatments. In any case, I doubt any of us knew how to. There was a rusty metal sign painted white with black lettering on the front gate that pointed to our establishment. The rust, accumulated over several rainy seasons, had eaten away so much of the sign that only Ku, L, a drawing of a lady with a huge afro and an arrow still showed. Our customers didn't need it. The directions were simple. Go up from Harare Gardens, skip 2 roads, take a left, skip another road, look for the blue house on your right, not the green one, and you're there. You'd have to be a nincompoop to miss it. The front section of the house, which once served as a lounge. Yeah, this story is so hot that my mic blew up. The front section of the house, which once served as a lounge, was converted into an internet cafe with a dozen or so computers. You could hear the fans humming and the shriek from the dialer from the pavement across the road. Their prices weren't too bad either compared to those at Eastgate or Zimex Mall. The rest of the main house was used by the Kumalo family, all 13 of them. Our salon was in the back in what used to be the boys' kaya, servants' quarters. From across the yard, the fragrant aroma of relaxers, dyes, shampoos, and a dozen other chemicals would hit you. The smell merged with dust from the driveway and left something in your nostrils that you couldn't shake off until the next time you caught a cold. Each morning, I was greeted by Agnes with, "Sisi Wimbai, you are late again, the customers are waiting." Mrs. Kumalo's eldest daughter held the keys and opened shop. I would make a sound like with my lips and walk in without greeting the cow. I hated her, she hated me twice as much, and so long as Mommy wasn't in, there was no need to pretend otherwise. Everyone knew I was the goose that laid the golden eggs. If I left, half the customers would follow me. In any case, letting them wait made them realize how lucky they were to be served at all. So I was actually doing the business a favor. There were 3 other hairdressers, Memory, Patricia, and Yolanda, plus Charlie Boy, our barber, who always came in smelling of chibuku. The salon was my personal fiefdom, and I was Queen Bee. I would throw my handbag on the floor underneath the cashier's desk and boil myself a cup of tea. There's a new style I want you to do for me. How often I've heard those words, usually followed by a folded picture from some glossy American magazine. I can do that easily. It's just the style for you. I always indulge them with a white lie. There's only one secret to being a successful hairdresser, and I've never withheld it from anyone. Your client should leave the salon feeling like a white woman, not colored, not Indian, not Chinese. And I've told this to everyone who's ever asked me. And what they want to know is, how do you make someone feel like a white woman? The answer is simple. Whiteness is a state of mind. Mrs. Kumalo understands this, and that's why she would never fire me. The other girls don't understand it, and that's why Patricia was fired. The stupid girl got pregnant less than 6 months into her job, so of course Mrs. K had no choice. Hairdressers are there to sell an image, and that image is not pushing a football in your belly. Suddenly, we had a vacancy. Little did I know this small twist of fate would cost me my crown. Thank you.
So, right. Both of you set your books in 2 very different spaces. Yours is in the urban area, a city, Harare, and yours is in a refugee camp. And yet, what you have in there, in both books, is contested sexuality. So, sexualities. So, for instance, in Harare, which is a city, there are, just like in Accra, there are gay people, there are lesbians, but it's, and people essentially live and let live, you know, as we see with Dumi. But in the refugee camp, there's a little bit more that happens. Can you tell us why you decided to set your book there?
Why I decided to set my book
in a refugee camp to start with. But particularly with the sexualities that you were dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, so the book was inspired by a painting, a nude painting. So in 2008, after I published my first novel, I went to Paris to celebrate, and then I went to museum, and then I came out with Degas' painting, which is a serious portrait of a woman taking a bath. And so this woman is basically taking a bath in a bucket, and that's how we used to take a bath in a camp. So it just clicked, it kind of brought that memory, but I think as I kind of wrote this essay for Granta called The Power of Nudity, I think for my characters, it was incredibly important for me, I equated this notion of nudity with getting rid of this overwhelming history of civil wars, independence war, and anything to do with that. So I really wanted an intimate portrait of my character, and that's what this kind of picture allowed me to see, you know? So the two kind of came together. But, you know, they say sex sells, but not when you have characters in a refugee camp, because it took really a long, long time. It took me 10 years to write. And a big part of that was because I was just walking away from people who just saying, you can't have intimacy in a camp. You know, you can't have these things in a camp. So it was almost like a resilient project for me to kind of say, no, these things exist. And you know, and my characters have that kind of power to accept the invitation of the body to center itself in their mind.
Dumi maneuvering his sexuality in a very homophobic Harare, where homosexuality exists, but he doesn't want to. The country acts like they don't know that it exists. Why did you decide to set it there as opposed to say Edinburgh, where you stay, or why Zimbabwe?
That's a very complex question that requires many different things. The novel came to me. I wrote the novel pretty quickly. It came to me on a Christmas day in 2009. And what I heard first was Wimbai's voice. I knew there was something not quite right about Dumi. And I grabbed a laptop and just started straight away. It was sort of like a free-flowing thing. But the structure of the story works with very simple binaries, right? Religious, non-religious, male, female, gay, straight, those kind of things. That's sort of like the tension that pulls the story along. So the setting for me was pretty organic. But I remember when I grew up, the reason that I wanted the hair salon to be a central space, and some of this is some kind of retro-rationalization that happens after you've written something and then you say, oh, I wrote it because of this. A lot of it just comes from the subconscious. But I look back and growing up, I was dragged into salons a lot as a kid. And you'd sit there for what felt like an incredibly long period, listening to these ladies, mostly ladies. Occasionally there would be a little barbershop there, but they would just be talking about stuff and talking about their lives. More importantly, they'll be talking about other people's lives. And you just be hoovering that stuff in. Who did what happened to so-and-so, what's the latest scandal? So I wanted to have this space in which people meet organically, but something scandalous is brewing. Something scandalous is always brewing. And one of the weirdest things for me is later on I had someone email me to ask, oh, was it so-and-so? There was apparently a famous male gay hairdresser in Harare in the 90s. I'd never encountered him. And they're like, are you writing about him? And I said, no, I didn't even know who this guy was. So sometimes fiction meets life in strange ways. You imagine stuff, and then you realize that it's already happening in the real world.
Like, okay, I didn't know the famous male hairstylist, but I kind of thought I knew who the male politician was. So, and you never did answer whether it was him.
So the story, I think, just listening to the passage, it works with a very sort of like informal, gossipy tone. And Wimbai, our narrator, throws a lot of innuendo into the story. She's constantly pointing at people. I mean, have you ever had that annoying story where someone comes to you and says, I have to tell you something, but I can't tell you who told me this stuff. Yeah. And whenever they do that, you always get this niggle. And so, as a writer, I think there's a lot to be said about what you leave out, especially when you have something that is this gossipy. So if you hint at someone, people go crazy. And I've had a lot of Zimbabwean readers just desperate for me to confirm whether or not it is actually this minister. And I think the whole conceit, if I were to say it's him or not, then the whole thing just falls apart and it stops working.
All right, carry on with the innuendo. Power relations, Suleiman. One of the, your character cannot, one of your characters, the gay character, if you will, in the story, cannot speak. And so I was wondering whether, I wasn't, there's a level where I was never quite sure when I was reading your book whether is he consenting or is he, a bit of a victim because this man is powerful, Thank you so much. Can you walk us through that? Because he doesn't speak, so
Yeah.
you deliberately make sure that he's this guy who doesn't speak, but we see through his actions.
I don't think it's deliberate thing. So can I just say a bit about the background? So the story is about siblings, and the older brother, he was born mute, so, and when his poor parents realized that he was mute, they took him out of school and invested whatever little money they had into the education of his younger sister. So as a result, he grows up not being able to speak, read, or write. So, and when she becomes older, Saba, the sibling, she feels responsible for the absences in his life. The absence of jobs, education, but also language, and that's why the book is called Silence is My Mother Tongue. But also she feels responsible for the absences of love in his life. And that's when the story actually becomes a little bit, I don't even know how to describe it, but you know, it goes into that kind of territory where you just have to be quite bold and illustrate what it actually means, this absence of love in his life. But it's interesting you say you define him as gay, because for me, you know, I found him to from the kind of
fluid.
From the kind of hints that I got, he was someone open to falling in love with human beings rather than the kind of label or defined sexuality. And you know, and that's one thing about him that stood for me. And in terms of power relationship, I mean, ultimately, you know, it's clear in the book, for example, although it's kind of done, you know, you're kind of witnessing it through action, that he is actually responsible. So when Eob, the businessman, he's way older than him, kind of gets attracted to Hagos, who is my male character. But Hagos is recipient of that love. Hagos is in power of allowing that kind of, you know, he is actually going out to seek that love. He's not submissive in any way. In fact, he is celebrating the fact that he finally found somebody who recognizes that needs in him, and he's accepting it as a result.
I absolutely get that, and I absolutely got that from the reading, but I think where I was coming from is from the perspective of, because this guy cannot speak, because he's mute, an outsider, an observer in the refugee camp where he is, will look at it as this businessman who is powerful is with this young man who can't speak. So,
but that's because I think it's a society strips disabled people of agency. You know, it strips them from dignity. And I think one thing I realized about working with Hagos, and I stayed with him for 10 years, is this idea of how we communicate power. You know, people think power is all about, I'm here, you know, but, you know, there's kind of subtle movement. It's kind of the fact that he is, you know, looking after his body, the fact that he is, you know, celebrating his sensuality, you know, what we're talking about yesterday, this idea of how a male body is kind of being known for the aggression, but nevertheless, for Hagos, it was kind of like, there's kind of poetic presence in his life. And I think all these elements are kind of, you know, they convey that this person is really in control, and he is allowing himself to surrender to whatever desire that he has and chase after this desire, even the fact that he is disabled.
Dumi is, on the other hand, very blatantly in control, and he's got agency blatantly in a way that maybe like this is a muted agency, but Dumi is very blatant about it. And he's like from this family where he's able to go and do whatever he wants. Tell us about that. Is that part of the reason maybe where he's able then to just assert himself and express himself, particularly because he's from a certain type of family, as opposed to say maybe if he was coming from like some village and you know, in Bindura, for instance, and he was coming from some village in Bindura, and then comes to Harare, and even if he was sexually attracted to other males, then he'd have to play it down in a way that Dumi doesn't. Does that agency that Dumi have a lot to do with the fact that he comes from the family that he does?
For those that don't know, I'm from a small mining town in the north, and certain people that have lived in Harare in the city, they tend to look down on us people from Bindura. So that's just how it goes. We now have a traffic light, so we've progressed since you last came. So the whole thing about Dumi, class is very important in the hairdresser of Harare, right? He's from a wealthy, affluent background, whereas Wimbai is more working class and pretty much just trying to survive. When I look at the makeup of our societies, I think this is where power comes in. There's a lot of leeway given to some people by virtue of their social status because they have access to resources. And we all know the law doesn't operate equally to everyone, right? There's people that can buy off the law that are so influential that nothing will happen to them. And so within the structure of this particular narrative, and this is kind of one of the curious things about, say, Zimbabwe's position to homosexuality. It's something that our politicians will bring out during election cycles because it's a vote winner. Everyone will clap. You know, it really gives us that anti-Western credential that we are desperate to show that, you know, this is a Western importation. We don't want it here. Therefore, we are very African. It's a form of nationalism. But in terms of how they actually operate, they don't really care. What the Zimbabwean government cares about is threats to its power. And gays are in no position to be able to threaten ZANU-PF in its position of dominance. So this is something that they trout out every so often because you get those headlines for it. But for someone like Dubi or people from wealthier parts of town, they would not have any issues. And where he does get issues, again, the issues tend to be because of someone's political future that's threatened by a revelation. I mean, we are the sort of country in which most people don't know that Mugabe was not our first post-independence president. He was the prime minister. There was a guy called Kenan Banana who eventually, it came out that he had done some sexual shenanigans, non-consensual. It was rape against one of his bodyguards. And it was a whole pattern of behavior. So we now have this as our first president who's done this. But when we talk about power, he didn't go to normal prison like most people. He was just put under quote-unquote house arrest, even though it seems he was free to move about. So the dynamics are much more complex. There's a lot of nuance there.
And you both had your books when, okay, homosexuality is there, but you know people are there and stuff and everything. But I think we have seen a wave of fundamentalism on the continent in the last few years, and a pushback on LGBTIQ communities. I think I don't know whether it was the same with you, whether you observed this, but certainly growing up in Zim, there was a level of live and let live, where there wasn't really a discussion about it, but now it's like blatantly like, oh my God, don't speak about it, it's un-African, it's this and that. How has that impacted the way your works have been received? Given that when they first came out, I didn't think that there was anything fundamentally that eyebrow raising, but now everybody's like doing this anti-gay pushback in certain places. And I'm not talking about in Europe. I mean, like,
Yeah, back home. I think it's it's a very, very important question. I think for me, First of all, as a writer, like I spoke yesterday, when I write a country in my own, meaning I completely isolate myself from the kind of expectation or what people will say about the book, it really doesn't, it doesn't figure into kind of my calculation. I don't calculate, I surrender to the story, and I will go wherever my characters take me, That's the first principle that I have as a writer. Then when it comes out, then people will obviously deal with it and respond to it in the way they do. But yeah, it's really interesting because I do get messages from men and women in my community who say, I feel seen, which is, I think, that's the most important thing to me. Of course, like, it's really interesting how when they say, for example, homosexuality is not African, they don't realize that actually what they speak in is the colonial language. We know that even in Ethiopia, where my father comes from, men were marrying men, women were in relationship with women long before everything else happened in Africa. So I think it's a two thing. One, as a writer, how do you respond to that? And I think I'm very adamant that it's not about bravado or saying I'm really bold or I don't give a fuck or anything like that. It's just that it's very simple principle. You follow the characters. If they have certain desires, then I will go with that. And then the other thing is that you just let the work speak to, for itself. But also I'm citizen, so there is that kind of activist side. I'm part of my community. Of course, there's always been negative reaction, but I can live with that because I do receive messages from people who like the work, who are, not so much like they feel, they feel seen. They feel like, it's really difficult to kind of, it's layer of factors.
Yeah, and when you talk about the role of colonialism in this, I think it's a very important factor, right? In the sense, we were talking about reclaiming the narrative, how there's sort of like a quashing down a stereotypical view of Africa. Here I think about the work of the Canadian academic Mark Aprech, who wrote 2 books, Heterosexual Africa with a question mark, and Hungochani. Gochani is the Shona word for homosexual. In it, he traces this idea to this Victorian colonial thing, right, where Africans were not quite human. They're closer to animals than human beings. And at the time, there was a belief that, well, the animals, the Western society has kind of moved away with industrialization from the natural order of things. And because Africans are closer to animals, the belief was animals do not engage in homosexual practices. Therefore, now you have this idea that where it is seen, for example, in places like Johannesburg, in the mines, they then explain it away by saying, well, these men that are engaging in this practice, they've been brought here by Europeans, taken away from their natural environment. So there'll be these pseudoscientific explanations, and that's how hideous that whole idea is. But anyone with an understanding of pre-colonial history will know that these practices have always been there. That's what it is to be human. In terms of the reception of the book itself, I think the Western reader is much more likely to think that it's controversial. When the address of Harare came out, in the first year it came out in Zimbabwe, it sold 500 copies. And I thought that was a little bit shit until my publisher rang me and said, yo, this is amazing. We haven't sold this amount of books since the 90s with Yvonne Vera's Stone Virgins. So yeah, I was, it was a thing that the readers there were enjoying it. But when most Zimbabwean readers engage with it, they're also just enjoying seeing Harare depicted in fiction, in a contemporary novel. They enjoy seeing aspects that are, that they recognize from their life, certain archetypes and characters. We've spoken about the minister. And most of the conversations that I have about the book are around this. And occasionally, someone might refer to sort of like the sexual aspect of it, in the sense that they recognize something in themselves or in someone that they know. And you always kind of have positive conversation. So the positioning of the discourse, and I think a lot of it is also to do with the importation of, or at least the engagement that we have with the American conversation on their own issues with sexuality, race, and stuff. We sometimes import these concepts wholesale, and there is that natural pushback to say, you guys are telling us what to do. We all know that in terms of how America engages with Africa, they tend to come and they want to impose certain aspects of their worldview onto you in exchange for a bit of aid or something. And I think that might be what's leading to the pushback. So it's that issue that happens, where you sometimes, or at least in my thinking, that the homosexuality itself isn't the actual issue. It is being used as an excuse to butt heads over something else that's off stage. At least that's my reading of those discourses.
Can I just add something to that? I think one of the accusations I get is that I have a Western imagination. But it's more complex than that, because I have, the things I write in my book are things I've seen back home, whether be it in Africa or in the Middle East where I lived for a while. Like, for example, when I lived in Jeddah, because it's kind of, because of the gender segregation, men don't meet women. And then so my book, my first novel, is set in the world of men. And it's this idea that, so this idea, because they don't have, they would say that because there are no girls, we young boys, there are no young girls around us, so we'll sleep with boys until we are married. So, so I'm not making up the things, it's not Western imagination. Actually, it's a product of all the societies I've been through, and I'm absolutely faithful to the societies, and I'm depicting it the way it exists.
Fantastic. I think we can open up for questions now from the audience, because we have less than 10 minutes, right? Hello, any questions? Incidentally,
it's embarrassing to talk about sexuality. I know it's difficult to sell books even for Africans about sexuality. I know that. We're supposed to do that. It's like, huh? It's what?
No, incidentally, actually, because you were talking about power, one of the more interesting things, insofar as the pushback with towards the West regarding, oh, you're telling us what to do, there is also the being pulled in by the also anti-gay lobby of the far-right Pentecostal, coming from the US actually. So one of the lead campaigners in Kenya is a member of parliament who goes on about how un-African homosexuality is and this and that. But this same man has, I think, like 7 children with 7 different women, and he's been like in trouble for child support and so forth and so on. But it's like, yeah, sir. Family values what? Type of thing, right?
Well, we were talking earlier about what we find acceptable in families, and already there's certain kind of abuses. In the address of Harare, Dumi, Vimbai, whose child was conceived of rape, actually at one point turns around to say the man that raped her is better than Dumi because he's gay. And so these are very sort of like complex and vile issues that arise, and the more I think about it, the more I think it's a reflection of battles, internal battles within ourselves. There is the face that we like to give the world, that we are one thing, without actually acknowledging that our realities are a lot more complex and shady than they might appear on the surface.
Ma'am, you had a question?
It was going along your question around the imposition of the West, and I just wanted if to know if both of you can expand a little bit upon the role of religion in terms of thinking about the ways in which we think about sexuality, how we talk about it, how we don't talk about it, or what that means in each of the different areas in which you grew up in.
I kind of want to touch on that a little bit, particularly with African traditional religion in particular, because I know there were cases where, like, when a woman could marry a woman or a man could marry a man, and it will be like they have the spirits of their uncles and whatever. So I'm wondering whether maybe if you can elaborate whether when you're talking about religion, you're talking about the religion that was brought into Africa or our traditional ones.
Okay, that's a valid point. And again, you've already alluded to sort of those aspects in spirituality. And in Zimbabwe, if you're a spirit medium and the spirit that, in certain parts anyway, that you receive is, say, male and you're a woman, therefore you are a representative of that particular entity. And these things have historically been permissible. So I think when we talk about religion, we also have to, there is this imagination that religion is this static thing, that things have always been a certain way, but we're constantly reinventing it. I mean, I grew up in a Catholic household, and we all know the Catholic position on these issues. But when you look at the priests themselves, those guys are wild, shall we say. And so across different faiths, we don't have an admission that we're making this stuff up as we go along, that even the most sacred texts themselves are open to interpretation. It's how we choose to view them in a particular historical moment. And you've spoken about the role of these sort of like evangelical American Christians coming in to also push their agenda. So this is part of it becomes an internal American dispute that spills outside, as many American issues do, that spill outside of their borders. So it becomes a proxy thing that is being fought outside of their own country because they prefer to fight their wars elsewhere. And we become a battleground for that. And I think we need to find an honest position in which we look at our societies as they have been composed before colonialism and say, what is actually our authentic position on this? And I think if we did that, we would come to radically different conclusions from this Victorian Christian thing that we are going with at the moment. And I should also add that largely living in Europe, they've abandoned that whole thing entirely.
For me, I'll keep it personal. Basically, I had an Islamic upbringing. And then what I discovered with my writing is that definitely I was incredibly conditioned, and so I couldn't write the characters the way they had to be written. And that's why I think I took, about a year, 2 years off writing, and I tried to rewrite my imagination. And I think I did that by reading difficult books that are incredibly free, watching films that are important, celebrating the idea of free love, for example. So every book became an act that was kind of breaking those conditions that I had in my mind. And when I talk about conditions, also talking about, writing and working in the West, for example, because it tends to be a very subtle society. There are all these ideas of Victorian in a kind of literary world, and I'm incredibly unsubtle in my work. And so, so for me, I had to go, to kind of break that kind of the wall of taboos in my head. So I came out of this experiment completely, I think, ridding myself of taboos. Even I came to the point when I was having conversation with people, there were no barrier. I didn't know anymore what was acceptable and what wasn't. But what this experiment taught me is this idea that for a writer, it's really important to uncondition yourself. And I think all of us have our own way of how we do it. But to me, it was really, and that's the point when I wrote Consequences of Love, and Silence is my mother tongue, but also my third novel, The Seer, coming out next year.
All right. Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming, all three of you. I was very interested in the bit about Canaan Banana. And I know at some point his wife applied for asylum in the UK, and I don't know what happened to her after that. And I also know from previous conversations that there are other heads of states in that region who have had similar stories about them. And I was just wondering, since you all are quite prolific fiction writers, if we will have in your future work stories about our heads of states that have different lives or more complex lives, and if we would see that in the pages as a way of sort of encouraging us to look at the completeness of ourselves. Because even if our heads of states are queer and nobody knows about it, and we talk about it, perhaps that might come in your fiction? That's just my question.
You want us to be killed?
No, I want you to live forever.
So yeah, that's a very interesting one. A few years ago, like I said, in Zimbabwe, the rhetoric comes up again and again, usually around the election cycle. And I remember several years ago, there's a gay rights organization in Zimbabwe, GALS, and and Gays and Lesbians of Zimbabwe. And there was now talk to say, hang on, some of these politicians spewing this rhetoric are known within the community for having certain proclivities. Maybe we should out them, right? But then the debate quickly turned to, hang on a minute, they're part of the community, but they're saying exactly the things that they need to be in power. Therefore, by outing them, do you not then score an own goal? And eventually, I don't think there's a list that came out. So it's kind of a known thing that this is going on, even though, the rhetoric itself suggests otherwise. In terms of writing something else, I did this in 2010, and it's great to see that there have been more books from the continent tackling these things, and so if the spirit moves someone, by all means they should.
No, I mean, I write from the subconscious, so I can't really prescribe to my imagination what I should be writing about. That's not for me, but I completely understand the question. I think it's very legitimate, and I think, and I'm not saying it because he's here, but Chika's Frankie book was really important. What I loved about it was the fact that it was raw. It was uncensored, it was complete declaration of love and the way he lived his life. And I think this is maybe a position for non-fiction writers, but for me as a fiction writer, I absolutely don't prescribe what I should write about.
So whatever moves you.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Or my imagination.
I think we've come to the end of our time. Okay. Yes, I believe we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. Thank you very much, Suleiman. Silence is my mother tongue, Tendai Huchu, for being in this discussion on The Hairdresser of Harare. I think both the books, I didn't see them at the bookstore, but I think they're available online. So, it's less trees wasted in this era of environment. So, yes, thank you very much. Please, can you give a round of applause to my panelists?
Thank you for that insight, panelists. Before we move to our next session, we have some minutes to visit the book stands and the bag stands. Please support a worthy cause.